Humans love animals, and we fear animals. We make monsters of them, because animals are dangerous, and sometimes they eat us.
Tanner?
I did a whole episode on the natural horror genre, but found that some animals are overrepresented in this particular type of horror film. Sharks seem to be the newest member of this trend, as an onslaught of cheap and not so cheap shark attack films showed us. But back in the day, it was the ape that was the big threat. Why were gorillas the go-to animal villain for the first few decades of horror cinema? I suppose this could be as simple as to say a primate is easily trainable, as we saw in The Unholy Three, where a chimpanzee was photographically enlarged to appear massive and menacing. Or one could simply do as the filmmakers behind the now lost horror film A Blind Bargain. They applied some ape man makeup onto an actor and called it a day. Or one could do as they did in the 1930s sound remake of The Unholy Three, where they simply slipped a man inside a gorilla suit and that was it. The gorilla suit has made numerous appearances since, from the hokey to the rather well done to the animatronically enhanced. So what is our fascination with these creatures? And why are we afraid of them? Author Michael Crichton, he of Jurassic Park fame, went on to write Congo, where the gorilla Amy talks through a voice modulator and uses sign language.
Peter. Hello, Peter.
While Congo is far from Crichton's best book, nor for that matter far from the finest Crichton film adaptation, it was at least interesting scientifically. Crichton wasn't making stuff up when he wrote the character Amy, the talking gorilla. Her real-life counterpart, Coco, was born in 1971. She began learning sign language at age 1. A common and amusing Coco factoid on the internet claims that Coco proved gorillas can lie. One day, in a fit of rage, Coco ripped a sink out from the wall. Once questioned about the sink, Coco blamed it on the cat. This and the lesser Crichton story Congo shows us that gorillas really are quite like humans. They have language, they have lies, and they have anger issues. Not hard to understand, given that they're often mistreated, both on screen and off. In the 1932 horror film Murders in the Rue Morgue, a gorilla stalks the streets of Paris, committing murder on behalf of a sinister Bela Lugosi. The film was based on the Edgar Allan Poe story of the same name, but just as much as it took from Poe's legacy, it also took from the legacy of past apes running wild on the silver screen. There were plenty of previous films featuring such events, though sadly only a few of them survive today. What makes Murders in the Rue Morgue notable was that it, along with the similarly themed The Monster Walks, was one of the last murderous gorilla monster films to come out before the ape genre got big. Real big. In the Rue Morgue, the animal is portrayed as a slave to its master's wishes, and the ultimate evil is man himself. The same could be said for King Kong, which took the ape genre and went ballistic with it. In King Kong, directors Marion C. Cooper and Ernst B. Schoedsack took what they had learned from their previous naturalist travel documentaries and applied it to an adventure plot that was out of this world. The story concerns a film crew exploring an island hidden in fog, where they find Kong, a gigantic ape. Also on Skull Island are several dinosaurs, but directors Cooper and Schoedsack made it quite clear that Kong was the star attraction. The reptiles, previously used to great effect in the 1925 adventure film The Lost World, here play second fiddle to Kong. Kong is early in the film treated like a terrible threat, but when he falls for Fave Ray, he is humanized. And the film absolutely plays on that human connection between ape and girl. The Willis O'Brien effect work further emphasizes the humaneness of Kong, making him a physical, real entity, even on accident actually, as we sometimes can see O'Brien's fingerprints on the stop-motion figure. Somehow, it all adds to the illusion. It makes Kong so very, very real. Kong is further drawn into the human world in the climactic third act, where he is kidnapped off his island and made into an exhibit for peering human eyes. Naturally, he cannot be contained, and film audiences are treated to one of the great monster film finales. But when Kong dies, we feel for him. It's hard not to sympathize with him, because he is so very, very human. That same level of sympathy is difficult to feel for other creatures, like the rampaging T-Rex in Spielberg's The Lost World. The dinosaur is more monster than hero, unlike Kong. It's just not the same connection between reptile and man. I think the filmmakers of the recent monster calamity film Rampage knew this when they made the big monkey a hero, while the crocodile and the wolf remained monstrous. Though speaking for myself, I was rooting for the wolf all along. Perhaps for obvious reasons. Back to Kong. In 1933, he was a gargantuan hit. RKO Pictures quickly pushed out an inferior sequel, Son of Kong. The film has Carl Denham return to Skull Island, where he discovers a smaller version of Kong. There's some back and forth, most of it thoroughly humanizing the ape. In the end, Skull Island sinks due to volcanic activity, and the son of Kong heroically sacrifices himself to save the man who kidnapped his father. No, it is not a good film, and only worth seeing for Kong aficionados. Over the next few years, nothing could really match the spectacle of Kong. Several Poverty Row films featuring gorillas, ape men, and human-ape transformations came out and vanished equally quickly. Even the Marx Brothers got in on the gorilla action in At the Circus, one of their lesser efforts, though as a Marxist, I gotta say, it's still worth watching. Schoedsack and Cooper finally returned to the big ape genre in the genial Mighty Joe Young, released in 1949. The film is pure adventure without a hint of the horror genre, so we won't spend too much time on it, other than to say that the film ends with Mighty Joe Young rescuing orphans from a burning house. It is clear at this point that Schoedsack and Cooper's interest in big apes is due to their humanity, rather than their animalistic threat. They certainly chose to tell increasingly humanistic stories in their trio of ape films, from the dangerous in King Kong, to the goofy in Son of Kong, to the human in Mighty Joe Young. In the 1950s, apes were out, and prehistoric and atomic monsters were in. But despite the threats being more dangerous now, with the beasts far more animalistic and much less human, they all still hailed from the spectacle that was Kong, and previously from the spectacle that was man in monkey suit.
Monkey! Monkey! I'm a fucking gorilla, you clown!
Okay, fine, important distinction. Apes are not monkeys. There are actually very few monkey horror films. Anyway, the cinematic language had evolved away from the apes, and it focused on other, more vicious monsters. But the Japanese, who were still recovering from the shock of the atomic bomb, took a cue from the humanity of the giant apes. In Godzilla, the monster comes out of the sea as a reaction to atomic energy. It was the first entry in a long-running series of Godzilla films, none of which, by the way, has ever managed to surpass the quality of the damn fine first movie. Director and co-writer Inoshiro Honda certainly knew of the King Kong phenomenon. Japanese filmmakers had already made some King Kong knockoffs, though little is known about them as they are long lost. But more importantly, as later entries in the Godzilla franchise show us, Honda knew to humanize his monster, making Godzilla a hero in most of the sequels. That being said, such was the admiration for King Kong in Japan that when they made the third Godzilla movie, King Kong vs. Godzilla, the Japanese filmmakers made the American Kong the hero and Godzilla the villain. A common misconception is that two versions of the film were made, an American one with Kong as the hero, and the Japanese one with Godzilla as the hero. This is actually false. Godzilla was the bad guy both in Japan and the US. It was only after King Kong vs. Godzilla that the Japanese monster was portrayed sympathetically. Also in the 1950s, the Yeti began popping up, usually portrayed as another primate. In time, this would lead to Bigfoot movies, though that's its own category, ripe for exploration.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
When makeup effects again advanced in the 1960s, 20th Century Fox decided to take a chance on adapting Pierre Boulle's novel, Planet of the Apes. Again, not horror, I know, but rather science fiction. However, I think it's important to note that the Planet of the Apes franchise and its origin novel came about from a tradition of apes as movie and literary monsters. Pierre Boulle's story specifically plays on the narrow barrier between humans and apes, cleverly subverting the power structures between us. The Planet of the Apes franchise was recently renewed in a series of critically acclaimed films with Andy Serkis as its primate hero, Caesar. Serkis, by the way, also portrayed King Kong in the 2005 Peter Jackson remake. I went to see that film with a close friend. He cried when Kong died at the end. Not only did he cry, he bawled. I'm not making fun of him. My friend is a very empathetic person, and he saw the film entirely from the point of view of Kong, and loved every second of the experience. I understand that, because we see ourselves in apes, and we're able to take their side. The entirety of the recent Planet of the Apes trilogy relies on that conceit. If we didn't sympathize with Caesar, the films would not have worked. Also, I'll gladly admit to crying at movies too, though I wish it had been King Kong. Instead, I have to admit I shed a few manly tears at the end of Mighty Joe Young. Speaking of Kong remakes, the 2005 Peter Jackson movie was actually the second time the original had been remade. Producer Dino De Laurentiis did his own remake in 1976, this time with an eco-friendly theme. His stated goal was to beat Jaws at its own game, though it seems he forgot that apes dominated the natural horror genre long before sharks swept in and took their place. So apparently did audiences. King Kong in 1976 did good enough business, but it wasn't able to outdo Jaws at the box office. Not even close. Perhaps it was because it wasn't horror. When the first King Kong came out in 1933, it was considered scary, it was considered horror, but the big ape films that followed, including the Kong remakes, Mighty Joe Young, Planet of the Apes, Congo, and Rampage, they don't belong in the horror genre. I think that is because the apes stopped being monsters. We didn't see them as threats anymore. Back in the old days, an ape was still exotic. But the more we see them, the more we recognize ourselves in them, and the less we are capable of viewing them as mindless killers. Perhaps, just perhaps, that's because we know the truth about what we're doing to them, exterminating them at an alarming rate, imprisoning them in zoos, cutting down their natural habitats. We know full well that the tables have turned, and that we have become the monsters in their story, instead of the other way around. My name is Wolfcraft. This is History of Horror. I'd sure appreciate a like, share, and subscribe. Join me next time for episode 19, In Defense of Creepy Crawlies. Also, if you want to check out some of my other works, I'm an author. My science fiction novel God of Desolation is currently available on Amazon, and my mystery novel Richly Drawn will soon be available on inkshares.com. Thanks aplenty.